Wilhelm Wundt, born in 1832 and died in 1920, is generally considered the true pioneer of psychology because he founded the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in 1879. Interestingly, his father was a Lutheran minister, just like the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived around the same time as him. Wundt, influenced by Darwin, believed that all living organisms, including animals and plants, had consciousness. In fact, he saw life itself as a mental process. It's important to point out that in Germany, the greatest philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and others believed in the primacy of idea over matter. The mental side of life was far more important than the physical side. The German school of idealism and philosophy has been immensely popular, not only in Germany but throughout the world. So Wundt also subscribed to the idea that life from the very beginning was mental as well as physical. So he believed that the true purpose of psychology was to describe consciousness. To prove his hypothesis, Wundt didn't sit in his chair. He got his hands dirty by dissecting frogs like a true scientist. Just as Aristotle turned philosophy into an empirical science, Wundt made philosophy into an experimental psychology. But the biggest challenge for any psychological experiment was that consciousness is not simply an external phenomena like in physics or biology. It's mostly internal. But this didn't deter Wundt. Wundt saw consciousness as a structure or a machine that can be broken down into smaller parts that can be studied. German science tends to be more analytical, breaking things down to its smaller parts or elements that each can be analyzed separately. He found subjects, real people, and showed them a beam of light. He measured the light's color, intensity, and duration. He then observed their reaction, either voluntary or involuntary. On top of that, he also asked the participants to describe the sensations they felt. He was thorough in his job, just like a true stereotypical German. He concluded that our consciousness is born out of our sensation, depending on the quality, intensity, and the type of feeling it triggers. For example, a smell triggers a certain sensation depending on its quality of good or bad, intensity, strong or weak, and feeling pleasant or unpleasant. Wundt put consciousness into three categories: representation, willing, and feeling. Representation simply means perception of visible images or intuitive imagination of memory of a particular thing, or even illusion, as Arthur Schopenhauer argued a few decades earlier. So representation simply means we find certain images, sounds, tastes, and so on like trigger warnings, either to act or not to act, to eat or not to eat, so forth. Rotten food versus a delicious pizza is an easy one. One triggers you to be repulsed and the other triggers you to eat. The second category of consciousness, which Wundt called willing, is our experience with the outside world, meaning it triggers us to act or not to act, run or not to run. So representation is the first warning trigger, and the willing is what we do with representation. The third category is feeling. So once we perceive something through representation, then we act as in willing, and finally how we feel after the fact. This is similar to Schopenhauer's theory of the world as will and representation, which I covered in my philosophy course. But Schopenhauer only talked about the blind will that determines most of our actions, and representation of that will is how we see the world. Wundt also conceded that the willing part was difficult to study as it is deeply internal. It is somewhat similar to intention, so it is always tricky to know the true intention of someone. You can study consciousness as a representation by providing the participant with images, sounds, smell, and so forth, which trigger certain acts or wills, either voluntary or involuntary. While the willing part is difficult to analyze, he asked the participants to describe how they felt. So Wundt concluded that the two categories of consciousness that can be studied are representation and feeling. The willing category, however, is difficult to study as it happens internally inside the person. Wundt conceded while consciousness was purely sensation based, cultural aspects such as religion as well as language also played a role in shaping it. In other words, consciousness was developed through our interaction with the physical world, but our culture or nurture side of life also plays a crucial role in shaping our consciousness. So, to sum up, Wundt pioneered experimental psychology by tackling the biggest elephant in the room, consciousness. He concluded that consciousness and life go hand in hand. Consciousness has three categories: representation, which is our intuitive perception of reality; willingness, which is an internal trigger that pushes us whether to act or not to act; and finally, feeling, which is how we feel after the act or inaction. In other words, the process of consciousness goes like this: we sense something, we act, and then we feel. In 1959, Charles Darwin published his famous book on the origin of species, in which he argued that humans have evolved from other animals through what he called the process of natural selection. Not only he revolutionized biology, its influence on philosophy was immense. It paved the way for philosophy to become more evidence-based, so a new discipline was born. Psychology came out to make philosophy of the mind a scientific endeavor. Around the same time as Wundt in Germany, there was an American philosopher-psychologist who saw consciousness somewhat differently. Not as a structure, but more like a stream with a specific functionality. Wundt belonged to the structuralist school of psychology that studied or understood the mind as a structure that could be broken down into smaller parts. American psychologists, however, favored a more Darwinian approach, which is called functionalism, which is related to evolutionary biology. According to Darwinian approach, species live and die based on how they adapt to the environment. In other words, in psychology, the mind or consciousness is an adaptive mechanism, not some solid structure that was bestowed upon us from God or somewhere else that can be broken down into smaller pieces. So one has to study it as a whole, not analyze its parts.